They zip-tied a 66-year-old Navy veteran to a utility pole broad. Daylight, no crime, just silence from the crowd. The officers laughed, took pictures, and walked away like it was sport. What they didn't know was the man's son had just become their new chief of police. Hi everyone, today we're starting with a story that doesn't waste time easing in. Imagine walking home after a simple haircut sun on your back, familiar streets around you, when suddenly you're zip-tied to a light pole by two officers who think your existence is suspicious. You show them your ID. You explain yourself calmly, but they laugh, snap a photo, and leave you there like you're some prop in a cruel joke. Now imagine your son is the newly appointed police chief of that town. This could happen to anyone, even you. So before we dive into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Now let's begin. The air in Montgomery, Alabama carried the kind of thick warmth that only late spring knew how to deliver, rich with the scent of magnolia trees and a hint of humidity that wrapped itself around your neck like a cotton scarf. Walter Gaines, 66 years old, stepped out of Perry's Cut Shack on Walnut Street with a fresh lineup and the steady gait of a man who moves slower these days, but with purpose. Folks around here knew Walter. He was the man who always tipped in cash and asked about your mama even if she'd passed 10 years ago. His denim jacket, weathered and sun-faded, still bore the Navy patch from his years serving overseas. It wasn't about showing off. It was about memory, about pride. He'd left Montgomery decades ago, drifted between coastal cities and military bases, but he came back recently because something in him wanted to rest, wanted to belong again. As he made his way toward Carter Avenue, just 4 blocks to the small rental he now called home, a police cruiser rolled up behind him. It slowed deliberately, not a patrol by glance, but a predator's circle. Walter didn't flinch, didn't look back. He knew better than to offer eye contact. "Hey, sir," one voice called out just as the cruiser came to a stop. "Can we talk to you for a second?" Walter turned, his hands already half-raised palms, visible in old rehearsed dance. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. 2 white officers stepped out. One tall and broad-shouldered officer, Trent Malloy, about 29, with a look that said rules were things he kept in his own pocket. The other, shorter, tighter built, moved with the erratic sharpness of someone trying too hard to look in charge. Officer Kyle Dressner, 31, though you'd guess younger by the smirk he wore. Malloy spoke first. "We got a report about someone loitering behind the Walgreens off Main. You match the description." Walter blinked. "I've been at the barbershop for the last hour. You can ask Perry himself." Dressner tilted his head. "Mind showing some ID?" Walter nodded slowly, reached into his back pocket, and handed over his license. Georgia issued. Veteran's ID tucked behind it. Both officers glanced at it, didn't hand it back. "We're just going to do a quick check for safety," Malloy said. Walter gave a tight smile. "Safety, huh? I served this country 25 years. Haven't hurt a soul since I came home." Dressner's lips curled. "Then you know how to follow orders." Something about that made Walter's chest stiffen. He could hear it, the tone that wasn't about suspicion, but about superiority. "Back up against the pole," Malloy gestured. They were standing near the corner of Maple and Carter, where the old lamplight hadn't worked in years, but the pole stood tall. Walter hesitated. "I haven't done anything. Just a precaution," Dressner insisted. And before Walter could say more, they were guiding him, hand not quite shoving, but firm. He didn't resist, didn't argue. That wasn't how you survive these situations, especially not as a 66-year-old black man in Alabama zip code, or badge reforms be damned. They reached the pole. Dressner pulled out a pair of thick plastic zip ties, not cuffs. Walter's breath hitched. "You serious? Just so nobody gets nervous," Malloy replied. Walter closed his eyes. The zip ties tightened behind him. The ridged plastic dug into his skin. Click. And then click again. A photo. Dressner smirked. Smile. Walter clenched his jaw. Across the street, a woman with groceries paused, then kept walking. A boy on a scooter slowed, looked, and sped up. Nobody was stepping in. "You feel good about this?" Walter asked. Malloy shrugged. "You'll get a wild story to tell your bingo buddies." "I don't play bingo." "Well, maybe if you weren't so uptight enough," Walter muttered. "Y'all done?" They left him there 5 more minutes. 10. Then Dressner came back with a pocket knife, sliced the ties, and dropped his ID on the ground. "You're free to go." Walter didn't speak. He picked up the card, nodded once, and walked off. But not home. He turned toward downtown instead, past the church, past the closed library, until he reached the municipal courthouse. He sat on the front bench under a cracked mural of Lady Justice, sweating and breathing and trying to find words for what had just been taken from him. He pulled out his phone. No apps, no screen, just numbers. He pressed 1 and hit dial. Chief Gaines, a voice answered. Crisp. "Professional," Maurice Walter said. "It's your dad." A long pause. Maurice rarely heard from him unless something was wrong. "What happened?" Walter's voice was low. "Your boys zip-tied me to a light pole. Took a photo. Laughed. Silence. "Where are you?" Walter replied. "Courthouse bench. Not going anywhere." Morris's tone changed, calm but electric. "Stay there. Don't move. I'm coming." And just like that, a quiet fire had been lit. Because what those officers didn't know, what they never thought to check, was that Walter Gaines had just been zip-tied by the father of the man who now ran their entire department. Maurice Gaines stood in his office, sleeves rolled up, heart pounding, beneath the clean lines of his dress shirt. He'd been interim chief of police for just under 6 weeks, and already the weight of the badge had started to reshape his shoulders, less like armor, more like stone. But nothing had prepared him for this. His father, the man who never asked for help unless the house was on fire, had just called to say he'd been zip-tied to a pole by 2 of Maurice's officers, and worse, laughed at, photographed, left standing like a public warning. Maurice locked his office door, sat down, opened his laptop. He didn't call for a report. He didn't wait for spin. He went directly to the department's internal body cam server, logged in with his override credentials, and typed in the location, an approximate time, Maple and Carter. Narrowed the window. 2 matches popped up. Patrol Unit, 6612 officers, Trent Malloy and Kyle Dressner. He clicked play. At first, just traffic noise, radios hissing, idle chatter. But then it rolled on clear voices, visible postures, and a camera angled perfectly as the 2 men confronted his father. Maurice watched without blinking. Every second carved deeper into him. His father's voice calm, his hands still, the officers circling, moving him. Then the zip ties, the jokes, the laughter, the flash of the phone. Pause. Maurice sat in silence for nearly a full minute. His father had looked down not from fear but from something else, from knowing. Knowing that even with a lifetime of service, he was still seen as a threat or worse, as sport. At 8:01 the next morning, Maurice entered the department's briefing room. No smile, no coffee, just a tablet in hand and his badge clipped firm at his waist. Officers shuffled in unaware. Some joked quietly. Malloy and Dressner sat side by side near the middle row, legs outstretched, talking like they didn't have a care in the world. "Morning," Maurice said, voice flat. "Before we go over assignments, there's something I need to address." He tapped the screen. The room's large monitor lit up. A still frame appeared. Walter Gaines, zip-tied to a pole. Head turned, face locked in quiet rage. One officer grinning behind him, holding up a phone. Murmurs shot through the room like sparks on dry grass. This footage, Maurice said, was recorded yesterday at 4:24 p.m. Corner of Maple and Carter. He pressed play. The room fell utterly still. The officers watched their own 2 men in uniform demeaning a civilian, a veteran. The kind of scene they were supposed to prevent, not produce. Maurice let the video roll until the very end. Then he turned slowly, looked at Malloy and Dressner. "That man you humiliated," he said quietly, "is my father." Malloy's eyes went wide. Dressner paled. "I don't care that you didn't know," Maurice said, "because it should never have mattered." He stepped forward, voice rising just enough to cut through the static in the room. "This department does not exist to intimidate retirees, to zip-tie veterans, to mock civilians because you're bored on patrol. That time is done." He reached into his coat and placed 2 sealed folders on the table. "Officer Trent Malloy, Officer Kyle Dressner. You are both suspended effective immediately. You will surrender your badges and service weapons before leaving this building." The silence was deafening. Malloy opened his mouth, then closed it. Dressner looked to the captain, but no one moved. Maurice didn't break eye contact. He left the room without another word. Back in his office, he felt the storm beginning to churn. A few senior staffers knocked on his door, but he waved them off. He needed facts, more facts. Not just the incident with Walter, but everything tied to these two. He called internal affairs. I want a full review, he told them. Every complaint involving Malloy and Dressner from prior departments. I want transfer files, exit memos, performance reviews, disciplinary reports, formal and informal. Yes, Chief, and don't route it through regular channels. Keep it offline. I want it quiet. He knew how these things got buried, knew how the old boys network operated, how it silenced whispers before they became paperwork. Hours passed. Files came in. Dressner had transferred from Birmingham, Malloy from Jackson. Both hires pushed through before Maurice had stepped into the role. Both with recommendations but no glowing marks. In the files, Maurice found red flags wrapped in bureaucratic language, exhibited an unprofessional demeanor during civilian interactions. Informal concern from community outreach staff regarding tone used with elder residents. Witness complaint dismissed due to lack of corroboration. 6 incidents. None of them punished. None of them fully investigated. Maurice leaned back, eyes burning. This wasn't about 2 bad officers. It was about what the system allowed them to become. He made his decision that night. The next morning, at a closed-door meeting with City Hall legal counsel and the mayor's office liaison, he laid out his findings. They violated department ethics. They embarrassed this department. They broke public trust. The mayor's liaison, a man named Brennan, with a Bluetooth earpiece that never seemed to stop blinking, leaned forward. Chief Gaines, we understand your concern, but some council members feel this disciplinary action could affect officer morale. Maurice's gaze hardened. Morale, he said. I'm more concerned about what it does to public morale when a 66-year-old veteran gets treated like a suspect without reason. Well, we're not suggesting inaction, just caution. Maurice didn't blink. There's nothing cautious about silence. He stood. This is my department. And if any part of it believes mocking veterans is acceptable, then maybe they need to find another badge to wear. By the end of the week, the termination letters were signed. Maurice held a brief press announcement. No spectacle, just facts. 2 officers were terminated following internal investigation of inappropriate conduct against a civilian. We are implementing department-wide reforms, random body cam audits, a new civilian oversight board, and a full review of past complaints previously marked as resolved. That night, someone left an envelope under his office door. Inside was a photo of a tree with a noose drawn in marker. No note, no return address. He didn't flinch. He locked the photo in his drawer and sat back down to work. Because this wasn't just about Walter Gaines anymore. It was about everyone in Montgomery who had ever been stopped, silenced, or shamed and told it was just procedure. And Maurice had no intention of letting that go quietly. 2 weeks after firing Malloy and Dressner, Maurice Gaines sat alone in the precinct's internal review room, sleeves rolled high, tie loosened, eyes locked on the monitor in front of him. The walls buzzed faintly from the overhead light, and his fingers hovered above the keyboard like a pianist between pieces. He wasn't looking for closure, he was digging for patterns. Because if 2 officers felt comfortable enough to zip-tie a veteran in broad daylight, then someone somewhere had made them feel untouchable. And Maurice wasn't about to stop at surface fixes. He requested every piece of body cam footage tied to Malloy and Dressner's patrols over the past 90 days, every stop, every call, every routine check. The footage painted a damning picture. One showed a teenage boy, barely 16, stopped outside a corner store, hands spread against the wall, while Malloy barked questions about suspicious behavior. The kid's voice cracked with fear as he insisted he was just buying gum. Another showed Dressner mocking a homeless woman during a wellness check, telling her, "You people always got a story." She had no shoes. It was 47 degrees that day. Then there were the gaps, times the body cams mysteriously lost audio or clipped out mid-stop. Maurice didn't just see bad behavior. He saw a culture, a sickness. He called a meeting with Detective Rosalind Beck, one of the department's longest-serving and most trusted officers. Sharp, measured. A woman who carried no illusions, but kept her ethics intact. "I want you to go through every internal complaint filed in the last 5 years," he said. Focus on the ones that were closed without follow-up. Rosalind raised an eyebrow. That'll be a lot. I know, he replied, but I need to know how deep this goes. And so she started digging. What she found shocked even her. One woman, a school teacher, had filed 3 separate complaints against different officers after being pulled over multiple times in 1 month, always by the same patrol unit, always told she matched a description. Her name, Mrs. Delia Norrington. She lived 2 blocks from the school where she taught. Another complaint involved an elderly man, Mr. Calvin Moss, who said an officer threatened to have his car impounded unless he moved it faster during a rainstorm. That complaint was marked as miscommunication, and on it went. Small abuses brushed off, quiet indignities filed away in beige folders that no one opened again. Morris gathered the documents into one thick stack. The weight of it felt like something physical pressing on his chest. He called another staff meeting, this time only senior personnel. He didn't ask for opinions. He gave instructions. Starting immediately, we're implementing 3 department-wide changes, he said, voice firm. 1, all patrol stops without resulting arrests must be logged in detail and reviewed within 24 hours. 2 random body cam audits will take place every single week, not monthly, not quarterly, weekly. Civilian oversight will be part of the audit. 3, we're reopening every single complaint marked closed over the last 5 years. If it didn't have follow-up, it's coming back to life. A Captain Donnie McLean, an old-school fixture in the department, shifted in his chair. Chief, respectfully, that's a lot of man-hours. We're going to run into morale problems. Maurice didn't blink. Morale was never an excuse for misconduct. And if doing the right thing upsets someone's morale, then maybe they shouldn't wear this badge. The room went quiet. Some nodded, others didn't. But the order stood. That afternoon, as word spread through the department, the response was mixed. Some officers grumbled about being under a microscope. Others whispered that the chief was going too far, that he was making an example out of the whole force because of one bad incident. But the ones who had been quietly waiting, who had kept their heads down and their integrity intact, they noticed. Maurice started getting quiet knocks at his door. Officers who wanted to talk. Officers who'd seen things, reported things, and had their concerns dismissed. I told a supervisor last year that Malloy was too aggressive during stops, one officer said. I was told to stay in my lane. Dresner used to brag about how nobody checked his cam footage, said another. Said it was all politics anyway. The system was bleeding from within. But now the bleeding was visible. The mayor's office, now under mounting pressure from both public and press, scheduled a private meeting with Maurice. It wasn't a request, it was a directive. He arrived at the city center's glass-paneled top floor just before sunset. The mayor, Harold Bexley, a smooth-talking man with manicured hands and a practiced smile, met him in the conference room. You've made quite a few headlines, Bexley said as they shook hands. I didn't write them, Morris replied. But you lit the fire, the mayor countered, pouring coffee into 2 porcelain mugs. These reforms, they're bold. Maybe too bold. Some of my donors are law enforcement families. They're nervous. Maurice leaned forward. My father was humiliated by men wearing your city's uniform. And if this department had been doing its job, it never would have happened. We're not debating that, Bexley said quickly. But from a political standpoint, you're coming in hot. Maybe let things settle. Maurice sipped his coffee. Let the silence stretch. I'm not here for politics, he finally said. I'm here to clean house. If that threatens someone's donation roster, they're welcome to find another table. He stood. Meeting over. That night he walked through downtown Montgomery, blending in with the quiet hum of the streetlights and the low music from open-car windows. He passed a mural that had once been tagged with graffiti and now featured a hand-painted quote from Fannie Lou Hamer. Nobody's free until everybody's free. He paused there, watched the light reflect off the words, and remembered his father's face tied up, held still, refusing to beg. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, of dignity, of justice, of belief that the badge still meant something. When Maurice got back to his office, there was a message on his desk, scrawled on yellow paper. No name. Keep pushing and you'll end up just like him, tied up and forgotten. He read it twice, then calmly tore it in half and dropped it in the shredder, because they didn't scare him. and they never would. 3 days later, the sun rose over Montgomery with a heat that promised sweat before noon and thunder by dusk. Maurice Gaines stood at the edge of Jefferson Park, buttoning the last clasp on his suit jacket, eyes scanning the crowd that had already begun to gather beneath the white canvas tent. It was Family Unity Day, a community event hosted by local churches and neighborhood coalitions. The kind of thing his father used to quietly volunteer for setting up folding chairs before anyone arrived hauling coolers without being asked. Today, Maurice was asked to speak. He hadn't planned to. He wasn't in the mood for optics or handshakes. But after the recent reforms and the press attention swirling around the police department, the invitation came with weight. People were watching. And more importantly, people were deciding whether to stand behind him or wait for him to fall. He stepped onto the makeshift platform. The mic wobbled slightly. A gentle hum rolled through the crowd. Babies crying, sandals scraping on pavement, the soft whir of snow cone machines behind rows of chairs. Maurice didn't have notes. He didn't want them. "Good morning," he said, his voice clear but low, forcing the audience to lean in. "I wasn't supposed to be here. Wasn't supposed to say anything today. But sometimes silence sends the wrong message." A few heads nodded. He paused, looked out over the sea of faces. Young men in basketball shorts, grandmothers with hand fans, teachers, store clerks, ministers, kids with juice boxes. "A few weeks ago, Morris began. My father walked home from the barber shop just a few blocks from here. He didn't do anything wrong. He wasn't loud. He wasn't carrying anything. He was just there." His voice grew tighter. "He was stopped, zip-tied to a utility pole, and laughed at by two men wearing the badge I now oversee." A gasp ran through the front row. Others had already heard the story, but this was the first time they heard it from him. He didn't fight back. He didn't shout. He complied. And still he was humiliated. Photographed, treated like less than. Maurice let the words linger. "No rush. I fired those officers," he continued. "Not because he was my father, but because he was someone, a citizen, a neighbor, a veteran. And I couldn't look myself in the mirror if I let them get away with it." Silence now. Even the kids went still for a breath. If we only care when it happens to our own, we've already lost. A slow clap started from somewhere near the back. Others followed. It wasn't explosive. It was respectful. Solid. After stepping off the platform, Morris shook hands and accepted quiet nods from people who hadn't made eye contact with him in years. One woman, Miss Delia Norrington, gripped his hand with both of hers. "Thank you for seeing us," she whispered. "We've been here this whole time waiting." But not everyone was grateful. Later that evening, two off-duty officers sat at a dimly lit bar off Highland Avenue nursing beers and chewing over recent events. "He's got a chip on his shoulder," one muttered, twisting the cap off another bottle. "Using the badge to settle old scores." "Yeah," the other added, and throwing good cops under the bus to look like a hero. "Watch first chance he gets, he'll come for the rest of us." The line between loyalty and accountability had become a fault line, and cracks were beginning to show. Back at headquarters, Maurice sat with Detective Rosalind Beck and reviewed the updated complaint logs. More citizens had come forward, inspired, angry, relieved. They brought old stories to light, encounters they never filed because they assumed no one would care. One man said he was pushed against a car for walking too slowly past a patrol unit. A mother described how an officer mocked her teenage son's stutter during a noise complaint. A gas station clerk handed over security footage of an officer berating a customer for talking back after refusing to show ID. Maurice added each case to the internal tracker. One by one. "We're going to need more staff," Rosalind said. "This is a flood." Maurice nodded. "Good. Let it flood." He spent the next 2 days finalizing the structure for the Civilian Oversight Board. He selected members from local nonprofits, retired educators, faith leaders, and even one small business owner who had once filed a complaint herself. Their job would be to audit body cam footage, review citizen complaints, and ensure that accountability didn't end when headlines faded. But the pushback came fast. An unsigned letter arrived at City Hall. "The new chief is dangerous. He's dismantling the department from the inside. Someone needs to stop him before it's too late." At a private security meeting, one councilman voiced grave concerns about Maurice's aggressive tactics. And then Maurice got the call. "From the mayor. We need to meet," Bexley said. His tone was clipped. They sat across from each other in the same sterile conference room as before. "You're becoming a lightning rod," the mayor said bluntly. "Morale is dipping. We're getting calls from other cities. We can't afford to lose more officers. This isn't sustainable." Maurice leaned in, elbows on the table. "You want me to dial it back? I want you to be realistic." "No," Maurice replied. "You want me to pretend the problem's fixed so you don't get angry donors. But I didn't take this job to babysit feelings. I took it to fix what's broken." The mayor exhaled. "Some folks think you're on a crusade." Maurice gave a thin smile. "Maybe I am, and maybe that's what it finally takes." He stood, thanked the mayor, and left without shaking hands. Later that night, Maurice visited his father. The porch light was on, and Walter sat in a faded armchair, a glass of cold tea in hand, his boots resting on a milk crate. "I heard you shook the town up today," Walter said without looking up. Maurice smirked. "Just told the truth. They don't like truth when it burns." "I know," Walter sipped. "You scared? No. Then don't stop." They sat in silence for a long time. A few houses down, someone played Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come" on a crackling radio. Maurice closed his eyes, letting the melody settle into his chest, because the change was coming, and it had already started with him. 3 weeks after the Family Unity Day speech, Morris Gaines stood at the back of City Hall's press room, adjusting his collar as the final cameras settled into place. This was it. The moment most interim leaders either fade into asterisks or step fully into the weight of their title. The room was crowded not with national press, but with neighbors, local radio hosts, school teachers, retired veterans, a few skeptical business owners, and at the very front row, sitting calm and unreadable in a dark blue suit, was Walter Gaines. Maurice's father hadn't attended a public meeting in years, but today he was here. A staff member tapped the mic. "Now announcing Chief of Police Maurice Gaines." The title wasn't interim anymore. Maurice walked up slowly, one hand tucked in his jacket pocket, the other resting briefly on the edge of the podium. No script, no cue cards, just the faces in front of him and the work behind him. "I want to thank you all for being here," he began. "This moment isn't just about a title change. It's about what this city expects from the people who wear this uniform and what we will no longer accept." He took a deep breath, not to calm himself, but to center the moment. "We have launched a civilian oversight board that begins operations next week. Every body cam file from patrols will now be subject to review. Every complaint, filed or anonymous, will be logged, preserved, and evaluated by people outside of these walls." He continued, explaining new de-escalation training, community liaison officers, and revised stop and search protocols. "This isn't about punishing police," he said. "It's about rebuilding trust, about making sure the badge means protection, not intimidation." Applause followed, not thunderous but real. Earned. After the press cleared and the room began to empty, Walter approached slowly. The two men stood without speaking for a few moments. No cameras now, no podium, just father and son. "You done good," Walter said, his voice low. "I watched you today. Watch them listen. Not just hear you listen." Maurice smiled. That was the goal. Walter reached into his coat and handed over a small envelope. "Found this in an old box. Figured you should have it now." Inside was a photo, Walter in his 20s, standing in uniform, half smiling, in front of a corrugated metal wall with 3 fellow Navy men. The back was dated and labeled in faint ink, Da Nang, 1981. Maurice turned it over slowly. "I've never seen this. Most folks don't need to hear the whole war to know the cost of one battle," Walter replied. "You're fighting a war of your own now, just different terrain." They shared a quiet moment. Then Walter added, "Keep it in your office, on the days when the weight gets heavy." Maurice nodded. He didn't need to promise. The photo already had a place waiting. By the end of that week, the first civilian oversight meeting was underway. A dozen members from across the city sat in a modest room on the second floor of precinct headquarters. They were given access to body cam samples, reviewed anonymous complaint forms, and received training on redaction and privacy law. It wasn't perfect. Some were nervous, some unsure, but they showed up. That was the beginning. And across the department, things began to shift. Officers who'd once rolled their eyes at community reports now kept their cams on him full-time, even in parking lots. One even stopped by Maurice's office unprompted. "Just wanted to say," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway, "that oversight board, it's keeping us honest. Maybe that's a good thing." Morris didn't reply, just nodded. He knew change like this wouldn't come with applause. It would come with resistance, with quiet complaints, with rumors whispered in hallways. But it would also come with truth and dignity and maybe eventually trust. Still, not everyone had accepted the change. At a bar across town, two former officers who'd turned in their badges since the reforms muttered to each other over drinks. "He's tearing it down," one said. "No," the other replied. "He's making sure people can't hide in it anymore." And in that tension, the town kept moving, choosing sides, learning to speak aloud where once it had whispered. On the final Friday of the month, Morris visited his father again. No cameras, no speeches, just a brown bag with two styrofoam boxes, fried catfish, collard greens, and hot water cornbread from a spot Walter had been going to since 1978. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Maurice had done math homework and learned how to balance a checkbook. "You still put hot sauce on your greens?" Walter asked. "Still do," Maurice replied. "Some things don't change." The food was warm, the silence warmer. Midway through the meal, Walter leaned back. "You know, I used to think justice was about punishment, about seeing people pay. But maybe it's about memory, making sure nobody forgets." Maurice set down his fork. "They won't forget this." "No," Walter said. "Not this time." Because now the people in power weren't just holding the line. They were redrawing it. And for the first time in a long time, Montgomery wasn't just another name in a story. It was a starting point. Sometimes justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins at a street corner, a barber shop, a dinner table. It begins when someone dares to say, "This isn't right," and means it. What happened to Walter Gaines was humiliating, yes, but it became more than that. It became a moment that pulled back the curtain and forced a city to look in the mirror. It became a spark, and Morris Gaines made sure it lit something that wouldn't burn out overnight. And if you take anything from this story, let it be this: you don't have to wait for power to stand for truth. Whether you're wearing a badge, sitting on a school board, or just watching from the sidelines, your voice matters. Your silence, that matters too. Reform doesn't come from a headline. It comes from consistency, from people willing to do the work when the cameras are gone. And it starts not with the worst in us, but with the best of us choosing to be better. So if you've ever been silent because it was safer, or quiet because you thought it wasn't your place, let this be your reminder: justice doesn't need volume, it needs courage. And courage, that's something we all carry, especially when it's time to remember who we are.